Hello everyone, today we talk about princely Germany. This video is going to be closely connected with the one I made a couple of months ago about 19th century German historiography, romanticism, nationalism. It's not the first time we discuss the late German Middle Ages. You know that princely Germany stands for essentially this period conventionally established by historiography, stressing the aspect of the fragmentation of public authority, the rise to power, in fact, of the German princes as de facto lords of private of the empire, and all a series of course, political, institutional implications that today we're going to look at. Of course, the empire did continue, but of course, there was this fundamentally is the late medieval crisis. It's the contraction of universal powers. The papacy, the empire, fundamentally drift away from, say, many areas in Europe that fundamentally are contracting on their own themselves. There is a rise of national monarchies. And the area of the German Empire, so if you want just Central Europe, because the Holy Roman Emperors did keep going to Italy at some point, but as we'll see now, I made multiple videos about Henry VII, Ludwig the Bavarian, etc. But of course, there's a dramatic shrinking from previous times, and the relations between these regions in Europe is modified substantially. All right, so this is going to be a long ride, so I thought to split this video as well in two parts, right? I'm not really following that as a strategy, but I realized that when, there is a big topic with a lot of stuff to say, I think it's useless to just try to condensate everything in a single video and just, taking the adequate time to go a bit more in depth in the single issues, the single topics, right? There is a pretty hefty Holy Roman Empire and medieval Germany playlist that deals largely with these problems, right? I did study, my field of expertise is actually the empire in my job out of here. It's, of course, in part the same job I have here, but just in very different ways. On Schwerpunkt, I specifically dealt mostly with 11th to the 13th century. It's a bit the peak, right, of the Germanic imperial power and the traditional ideology standing behind that. I have something in store about the sort of connection with the Germanic ethnos, with the Ghibelline Middle Ages, what was, really the deal with that, what's the role of the papacy, what's the role, and it's not so dichotomic or simple. I've seen this being discussed on other channels. I didn't watch videos, but just for how they were framed or titled, I realized that it was just, again, this is the papacy against the empire, and missing what actually lays in between that, and why this concept even came up in the first place. But it's a very different thing from how, of course, universal powers had developed and would actually keep interacting later on. And as you know, it's a history that basically lasts until the 19th century, right? Secularization. The Papal States actually do continue to this day with the Vatican City, but naturally with a very different profile. So there is really a lot to uncover. But today we really look just at Germany, or if you prefer, at the imperial lands of Central Europe, so Bohemia as well. And in another video we will deal with basically the same concept for Poland, Hungary, and as you know, those were out of the empire, but were also very influenced by the Germans, especially in the High Middle Ages. And there are similarities, especially considering the Ostsiedlung, at least not just for the local colonization, but also for this literal shift of Western, very Western, in some cases French, within the same Holy Roman Empire. Think about the Luxembourgs. In fact, dynasties to the thrones of within Germany. We're talking Austria with the Habsurgs came basically from the opposite direction of Alsace. The Luxembourgs, in fact, in Bohemia. The Anjou, both in Hungary and Poland, right? And this happens all at basically this late medieval crisis turn point, and one must give an explanation for that too, and one must know, in fact, for those cases out of the empire, what was the situation in the other other Central European monarchies. And I think Germany is very unique in its own kind. Every kingdom naturally has its own characteristics, but in spite, and today we will characterize better what in fact made it the German way, plus Bohemia basically was integrated at this point in the system, as opposed to this other neighbors. But the key term is Central Europe, right? For too long, and this is something that has emerged even in the, say, because I evidently refer to it often in some other discussions out of here about my channel, like I do stress strongly the fact that there is a Central European dimension that sometimes I ever get any kind of criticism, but I think I struck some chord at some point with someone who didn't like the idea of Germany being Central European, not Western European. I think it's a sort of, there are some areas in Germany that are some more, westernized. There are some, especially today, Germany is just one of the most Americanized countries in Europe, but the specificities of Mitteleuropa and what the substantial difference, if not the radical one, existing with the western third of Europe's narrowly meant, are enormous and incredible. And I am very attentive towards that, because when we talk about the German historiography regarding this era, the late medieval, princely, if you prefer, Germany, there is obviously and necessarily a comparison with the majestic history of especially the French, but also the English monarchies in the later Middle Ages. Those were systems that succeeded. Doesn't matter how hard the crisis hit. We've seen, really, there is an entire playlist I made about the late medieval crisis, the 14th century, where many areas in Europe affected by that. Also the empire, think about the Hussite, say the Crusades against the Hussites, and there are also the deep implications also with lands that were not part of the empire, such as Hungary. But we've seen the Jacquerie, we've seen the instances of Tyler, Bolt, etc. And we have appreciated how, however, by the late Middle Ages, you do have fundamentally a state, right? Especially in France, in England, also fundamentally in the Iberian monarchies, that, yes, would not be united formally until the late modern era on an institutional level, but that had been developing within the Iberian Peninsula as a pretty massive system, right? There is even in Italy actually a regional dimension that the main city-states had achieved in conquering large swaths of the peninsula. Think about Milan, but also the countering Venetian ambitions. The same Tuscan papal states, with their particularism, in many ways were sort of more continuous, sort of more homogeneous, and also advanced to some degree. Polities, states, there were real states in that regard compared to Central Europe and many areas in Germany, to say the least. And what you see here is a princely coming back, right? It's not like an appearance or a surprise. It's really the history of the German Empire is all about this. It's about the tension, the inherent tension between the centralizing point, essentially the attempt of establishing a German national monarchy, and the centrifugal push from the side of the local princes. And the interesting thing, we're discussing in the video about 19th century German Romanticism, nationalism, is that in that crucial time in history, German historiography, but also in the 20th century, I mean, if you think about, the First World War, what emanated from that regarding the end of the Second Reich, the rise of the Third and the fall of the Third, right? There is a lot of stuff going on about this topic, right? And there is no doubt that the Germans suffered historiographically in acknowledging the absence in the German political institutional history of the late Middle Ages of a tradition, and therefore a perspective that could be read in a unitary and national way, right? This is not to say that I have something to say about this as well, because I do think, after all, that that's exactly it's part of the Sonderweg, in this sense, the idea that this was the German way, right? The Germany was not really like the Western monarchies. It wasn't like the Slavic world. It wasn't like the Scandinavians or the Italians, and so that this federal system that emerged at this point, in definitely a dramatic way. Nobody denied that, especially the end, say, of the the decline of the empire, but especially the end of the attempt of establishing a German national monarchy was painful in the 19th century, especially nationalistic ideal. In romantic terms, it was a bit of a different thing, but we discussed this already in those videos. Just realize that, of course, when the Prussians were uniting Germany, it wasn't just about the fact of the Germans simply saying, well, okay, we're all happy about this, right? There were, as you know, even after World War I, substantial independentistic movements, not, say, especially at that point, to be going much anywhere, even if, Hitler had not come to power and so on. But that had opened a big question, right? The fact that Germany had been unified quite recently politically, but that there was still a German spirit, especially a German language, right? Something that could be extended to some degree even in pan-Germanism and through an imperialistic perspective, etc., that naturally had, at least from a historiographical point of view, these scholars to be obliged basically to confront themselves with an incredibly complicated late medieval history in Germany, where that as one of its greatest challenges, and I have it on Schwerpunkt to some degree. I hope we will be talking a lot more about late medieval Germany, because we haven't done that much, and this in part reflects, even through the cycle that is sort of random, the shine away, in a sense, from a historiographical point of view from this period in practice, right? And because it is true that we still normally read history in a sort of by chunks, so in a sort of national, at least, perspective, even when we know that, of course, in the Middle Ages things were slightly different, and yes, there was a sense of nation, but the degree is what you have to discuss compared to other sense of identities at a local level, and Germany is really a thorny topic, right? The country was fragmented in over 300 states, if you can call them that way. And albeit you do see at this point in history this important, coalescences of political, territorial powers, mostly based on this princely dynastic fashion, you also realize that that enormous dream that had been the one of the empire, but also the one of having a functional national monarchy, fundamentally had evaporated, right? And that there were some mechanisms that were still keeping this system on their feet, but that were mostly just a cover for, say, a de facto much more concrete grabbing and consolidation on, again, dynastic bases that were, in that sense, that volatile, right? There were some, of course, successful say, political compactions here, but others also sort of vanished and or were not able to assert themselves in the following centuries just in the way others would succeed, etc. So it's a complicated history. It's also part of the early modern one, but just think about the Habsurgs, right? By the second half of the 14th century, the first half of the 15th, there was really nothing teleological or deterministic about this becoming still one of the major powers in Europe, and just a dynasty surviving per se. It was a very complicated thing. Equally, just from a dynastic point, if you think about Bohemia, I made a video about this and how it passed into Habsburgic hands. In fact, at the end of this period, that was, Luxembourg, Bohemia, as I described it many times, was the heart of 14th century Europe. And not only the Hussite wars basically destroyed the country, that was thus basically taken over by the Habsburgs, still with their prerogatives, whatever, but basically making collapse a hell of a concentrated power first the Premislis and the Luxembourgs had managed to develop, but bringing to an end properly of to an independent history, right? Think about the divides existing within Germany. We've seen them also in the videos about the 30 Wars army organization. I mean, Brandenburg and Saxony, by the first half of the 17th century, technically still were feudal countries. They had feudal armies. They hadn't changed much from the Middle Ages at all. The Habsburgs had gone instead much more far, and yet it would be to unify Germany later on. So you understand how, in a sense, complex this is. There's also another fact that both the Habsburgs and the Hohenstaufen were essentially to eventually hegemonize German politics, but by ruling largely from non-German territories, which were literally out of the kingdom of Germany. And so that's a history that, as you know, is radically intertwined with the fates of Poland, of Hungary, other powers. And so it's never easy. It doesn't definitely provide with a clear, unitary, unequivocal, unambiguous national narrative, right? And this has been a bit, perhaps, too much of a negativistic attitude, in my opinion. Surely, the disasters of Germany during both world wars and that sort of nationalist narrative, etc., brought, as you know, after 1945 to just all over the West, basically, to have very different narratives like structuralism, Marxism, taking the reins also of mediavistics, and therefore sort of eliminating the idea of the spirit of the empire, the tradition that it really embodies. It basically focused either on juridical institutional aspects of how the empire was kept together, and or local history, if not localistic history. This is also an oversimplification, but you understand why eventually there is even a coming back, naturally, a backlash against these ideas, but at that point without historiographical backbone, because everybody can, say, instinctively sympathize with a national perspective, but without absolutely knowing anything about, of course, its own country, its own history. And so creating more damage than anything into the same cause. So this was the dilemma of the German historiography. Could they make a research on state building proper, the Imperial Germanic era? So what we're saying were the two choices that were made. So there are two levels that are connected with each other, and so we will discuss one in part today, the other better tomorrow, hopefully. You get the intertwinement there, and so a bit the substance of the historical reality only if you deal with them in some sort of detail, right? So from one side, you have in part a continuity of the old traditional theme of the process of transformation and sort of settlement of the political system of the medieval empire, right? This is a huge topic because, as you've seen on Schwerpunkt, and as I was saying before, like the way you just deal with that the most is coming from a greater past, right? And that in which you're obliged also just by cultural reference to understand also a bit the prior origin to that, right? It wasn't a German empire appearing randomly out of nothing in the 10th century, right? It was a deep, universal, traditional, Catholic sense of what the empire was. This was the same Roman Empire, whether people were also obsessed with Byzantine legalism, really like it or not. And there is a lot of theology and just, political, but also military history to fully understand the implications of this phenomenon. This is a huge thing, which, as you understand, does not go too well in parallel with the general tenor, the general tone of late medieval historiography that just by itself, not just for German history, but tends to be a bit more structuralistic in nature. This is what normally happened from a historical point of view, that the later the Middle Ages, the lazier the attitude in understanding the actual universal meaning of the Middle Ages, a sort of pre-modern set of conceptual categories, methodologies, whatever. I know, fortunately, people. I specialize up to, let's say, the mid 14th century, so I'm all about Henry VII, Ludwig of Wittelsbach, in part also Charles IV, John of Bohemia before him. But I do have the privilege of knowing people who do study the persistence, actually, of a Ghibelline ideology based on the traditional values, say not this sort of feudal anarchy, as many people think that these ideas were just the alibi for, both in Germany and in Italy. The latter especially is very important because it shows that the empire, and this is something that is perhaps more familiar to somebody who studied 17th century European warfare, like all the some of the great names of the Habsurgic commanders coming from the Italian subject and so on, that have been sort of a bit, because of the Renaissance progressivistic, modernistic ideas, sort of taken away from. It's all about technology, man. It's about the military revolution. It's not about what these people actually believed in and had kept uninterruptedly believing in, right? And so, of course, there are serious, competent scholars that study also late medieval Germany in function, of course, of what the empire really was at the time, because that, of course, never came to an end, nor anyone would ever think that, right, before, half of a millennium, which was actually abolished, and by force, by the way. On the other hand, there have been lots of studies connected with state building within the circumscribed space of the single regional or sub-regional even political formations. And the latter's current is sort of the most recent, at least the one that has just, for the reasons I will not digress on, how we make history today, generally speaking. In fact, the most recent it has provided the best fruits, even, right? There is nothing wrong about that, unless you forget about the broader picture, which unfortunately also happens, right? But Germany, being the country of particularism in this sense, is a bit the apotheosis of it. No country is so politically fragmented like this at the time in Europe. Which doesn't mean that it was less, say, developed or less powerful. And that's also very interesting, and that's where the Sonderweg has something surely to be investigated as a concept in itself. But it was sort of a median area. That's where the uniqueness of Germany sort of, comes into play. It's both of a traditional but also modern country. It has this federal system of the empire, but it's also, at the end of the Middle Ages, as technologically advanced as Italy. It is between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. It has definitely, it's also huge, telling the truth. I mean, that there are lots of people living there, and it's territorially, geographically very extended, right? This current, historiographically, is known as Landesgeschichte, so obviously, territorial history, or local history preferred. Landesgeschichte, stressing the land that we will look at better as sort of a political institutional concept in the empire, and still today, actually, in Germany. of enormous importance, and that stresses, in fact, the continuity with the older, the ethnic duchies of once upon a time, and the actual circumscriptions that came to exist, to be recognized in this late medieval development. And it's a really prolific branch of historiography. And the political bias that shrouded it a little bit was the one of particularism, of sort of deconstructionistic emphasis on diversity. So there's this enormous variety of situations and solutions in the organization of the Landesgeschichte, that is to say, the territorial seigneury, which, yeah, it is true, if you really stick to the formal, nothing is equal, right? There's no single polity in Europe that is equal to another. And of course, Germany has lots of states, as we've seen, and so but say the smaller the greater the differences are also for smaller systems, telling the truth. I mean, Germany was very different from within itself, but it was mostly just to be very simple in a way, like mainly the difference between northern Germany and southern Germany, right? The areas that had been Romanized historically, and the areas that had remained, as we've seen, in the northeast, more backwards. Of course, the seat of the houses that would control the imperial title. Okay, lots of things, yes, but there is also a relative homogeneity in itself that you can't see as German in some way, unitarily. Or at least by this federal process, not to stress the national or even less nationalistic interpretation, but say Europeans by this point start understanding each other pretty much, especially when they looked abroad, which entails also there is this concept of nation within actually separated states, which is a very underrated concept indeed, in terms of the French, the Spaniards, the Germans, the Italians, the English, right? That's how they reason, right? This is mostly the broadly meant Western European club, right? And yes, they're separated, they're disunited. If you look at the history of Germany and Italy, of course, until the 19th century, you do not have a major state that manages to rule over all this. This would be called, in fact, during the modern age, so-called weak areas of Europe, because in many ways they had become the battlegrounds for greater powers in different times. But overall, there is a cultural factor that is much more unitary than one imagines. And that's a topic that, honestly, I don't know where to start from discussing on Schwerpunkt, because every time you propose it, it feels like you're pushing a nationalistic, unitaristic narrative. But there is no doubt that these, say, national culture was sort of born gradually, but sort of in depending on also the degree of political compaction, but still even beyond that, right? And it's always, of course, a history of elites as well. There are countries that are sort of more culturally putting out more culturally. But think about, Italy during the Renaissance. Early medieval, early modern European culture is Italian, but Italy is not united. Equally with Germany, like there is a sense that those are the Germans, and they have a lot to contribute on that same basis, independently from their local divides. And if you look even at the Western monarchies, like, in Britain, Ireland, you have the three kingdoms fundamentally. In France, you have essentially different nations that are forcibly brought under the French Empire, that we call monarchy, but de facto was that. In the Iberian monarchy is pretty much the same in many ways, so it's very difficult to identify in Europe, especially in these larger countries, like an area that even up to this day, is actually just, well, it's just the product of a fully unitary system. And so the main attitude being, so the modern unitary country is wrong, is bad. Actually not, because these countries have millenary history of historical continuity, and the myth of localism is just a deconstructivistic and morally relativistic, and in this sense more easy to consume by yes, nationalism, but also associated with socialism, as it came out historically to be, rather than, in fact, what is the Imperial Catholic tradition that strongly stressed and emphasized actually national characters. And this was true since Roman times as well. So there is no doubt. I made so many videos about the historical regional series discussing of course, the agglutination process of historical identities. I mean, we talk about Germany. It's fair to say that until, say, the 9th century, that there wasn't really even a concept of, let's say, a German nation, right? But there were some continuities historically that, in spite of the lack of political unity, were still perceived at the time. So again, this is not really what I want to discuss today, but it's important because when you read history, especially the one made in the last generation, say from the 1970s to, say, the early 2000s, and still to some degree, we are incredibly affected by again, post-World War II anti-nationalist narrative that in some ways is managed historically to point out sound things, but that completely missed another point of the story, which could have equally been provided, and was provided also before the Second World War, by nationalistic scholarship. Right? You can't read, I mean, you can't claim to have any competence in German, medieval German history if you haven't read Kantorowicz, Frederick II. Was it a nationalistic work? Yes, it was. Did it suffer of the imperial narrative? Yes, but it's one of the single greatest historical masterpieces in the history of mankind. You can't be a medievalist without having read that, and there is a very evident reason when that is the case. And there aren't people like Kantorowicz that also had a pretty dramatic history also later. As you know, he was a German Jew. He valiantly fought for the German Empire during World War I. Eventually he had relatives died during killed during the Holocaust, and he eventually went over to the United States to escape the persecution, and sort of had important sense of guilt for, say, part of the narrative that had flowed from German nationalism and other imperialism, etc., had flowed into National Socialism, among the other things. And considering that, say, Germany also had a very long history of anti-Semitism way before the Nazis were around, right? Centuries back. And so there you had an attempt to actually provide with a positive narrative for the sense of Germanness in a way that, as you understand, always evolves, and so you can't quite exactly and really differs on the basis of also these great scholars with such enormous ego, right? So really, again, lots of stuff you can always digress on as far as these topics are concerned, right? But in other words, don't be too fooled by the constructionism, by localism, by the sense that nobody really does have an answer about what the system really was, because there are different interpretations. If you're actually knowledgeable about the topic, you have a pretty solid idea about lots of things, and then of course there are always deeper levels, but there is a way to just establish the basics and then pass into this higher level actually of notion. So it's all about just how much time you dedicate to that. And I can grant you that at that point you will find people that agree or disagree with you, but history in this sense is very reliable in itself, right? The way sources speak and the way the past is there just to be unveiled, or is really much more important than what any scholar really thinks just per se. And this idea that every historian has to interpret on the basis of a very specific, philosophical current or methodological interpretation, history made by someone else very often is the first indicator of how subjective the narration really is, because it decides just to abandon itself to somebody else's idea and not really discovering your own, which in that sense is hardly a subjective thing, at least if you stay if you make the effort of staying objective at least. But we're digressing. There is also a question of land, right? When the Germans stress this, is Germany's boundaries changed a lot during the Middle Ages, right? Just think about the area of colonization east of the Elbe, right? The Ostsiedlung, the Rang nach Osten, and so on. So think about how different Germany was in the late Middle Ages compared to Charlemagne's time, and how many areas were even sort of agglutinated from the outside. Think about Silesia. Its Germanization had been firstly a part of Poland proper, and so we're not just talking about tribes, right? Like the Obrigeites and so on, and that sort of were cancelled from history after the German conquest. We're talking even about really changing and floating and very often ambiguous boundaries. Again, I made a video especially about the Crown of Bohemia during the early modern era. You realize how you have more than else like a superimposition of different dominions rather than in a typically seigneurial feudal fashion, and this is very Central European in modern history, rather than say what the French were doing, what the English were doing, and not all. Right, really, Central Europe is really a different thing. So this is important to stress. It doesn't matter how advanced Germany is today and how it was and how it boomed sort of after its unification. But one thing that must properly be understood about Germany is that it wasn't actually one of the particularly most developed areas in Europe compared to others. Right, we have this idea of German quality, of motors, technology, engineering, etc. But this is something that sort of is very recent historically. And say during most of the modern age, Germany was sort of a in between, right, compared to the most civilizationally developed areas in the continent, sort of the most depressed. And this, again, I don't say like in a negative sense. I think that this did give the Germans an extra gear that would have not allowed them to be what they are today, and that it's not recognized because either it's made a meme of the German efficiency or whatever. There really never was, even during the two world wars, evidently enough, or some sort of, again, these were real savages or sort of fanatics or whatever. There are deep reasons for what all came to be, and one can't really like if you read. Of course, there is no space for that, mostly among historians of World War II, but remember this, that most of the perspectives that you hear about this are, again, post-Second World War memes. And I don't say this in terms of the way World War II is being told was wrong to the most part. It's just, it was, for political purpose, a sort of almost embellished in some ways, for some countries, for pop culture reasons, right? For just the sake also of repacification, whatever. But European history is quite old, and the more I studied, the more I realized that European countries are much more continuously what they were already 2 millennia ago than than we tend to realize, and yet you have to understand all what happened during this time in order to characterize them in a way rather than another. And sometimes the changes were really gradual, right? Germany is also, because of this, a lack of a central power that would engineer the system, like, I don't know, France, or especially a bit of a sleeping beauty. Right after the 30 Years' War, the general impression was the Germans were actually meek people, because of how the country had been ravaged and devastated, losing up to 1/3 of its population, reflecting this during the past conflict. Right, so we're talking about also histories of true and brutal, traumatic desperation, and that's something that seemingly we have stopped it, fortunately, to some degree, but there are some problems with that forgetting in the last generations. But I mean, our grandfathers were living during World War II. Where's their legacy within us, right? About the awareness of what it means just to live in a situation like this, what it means to be a European, and what it means, just to struggle for power, and why and for which reasons. This is what I think in a very changed world we will have to reflect upon with some degree of guilt, unfortunately, because things are not going really like how we would have liked to, or at least how we were promised when we were kids, evidently. So let's pass to the concept of elective monarchy. Let's go step by step, really. So this is the point of Central Europe as a whole, and that's where Germany, you can appreciate how sort of similar in some ways it was to Bohemia, to Poland, to Hungary as well. All these countries had essentially witnessed and would witness, at least in different, say in similar times of their history between the late Middle Ages and the early modern age, the failure of their national monarchy, right? And the main reason, some were taken over, like Hungary, and later Poland. Germany, as we've seen, has this collapse basically by the mid 13th century that protracts itself over time. Bohemia is literally destroyed by the same Hussite revolution. And what this translates itself in institutionally is the election, not the inheritance of the crown. Right? We see this like, it was the Germanic Empire that really had this, but it was this, if you look at Central Europe, this is basically the standard. And the reason why this had happened in a way or another is not just enemy, say external enemies, but the internal ones, like essentially the nobility that preferred to basically abort the process of national statehood in exchange for their privileges that ended them up under somebody else's control and or are exposed to it. I mean, as we've seen in the videos about 17th century, or how many Protestant German cities were better off with under the French of Louis XIV than saying, having to listen to the Habsurgs and the papacy. Right? That was the level of disintegration of the Germanic Empire at the time. In vain, the dynasties that controlled, even for an entire century, the imperial crown, such as the Luxembourgs from 1346 to 1438, would tend, for this reason, to present themselves as a stock of kings, right? To stress that even though they were being elected, they were still sort of worth of that title, just on the same model of the Swabian house, right, that had really, as you know, brought the German national monarchic experiment to its peak, and so was aiming at doing what essentially the Capetians were doing in France, the Angevins in England, and therefore surpassing what had been an elective system was really traditional in all these other countries. I mean, still at the time of Hugh Capet, it was normal for the Western Frankish noblemen to have to literally recognize their own king. This was normal. It would mostly grow in a dysfunctional way. In most of the institutions would this remain over time. The only exception I can think was of a functional elective monarchy was the Longobard one. That, in spite of all the historiographical myths, was actually a pretty unitary system. Obviously, instead, were those, let's say, the state was more solid after all, there was a process of dynasticization. This is evident in England, this is evident in France, in Spain, even in the Italian states. Of course, Germany remains the same, but there is, at least throughout the Middle Ages, this sort of back and forth, because what are being formed now on the basis of which dynasties can rule are private states. And even these dynasties as such were not really recognized as we literally own this land, whichever it was, which was very often, based on normally on a traditional land or some other later feudal circumscription, but just also scattered across like many different places, sometimes at the very opposite ends of the same German kingdom. But in fact, just some lords of that place, right? And this was in theory, like, because the German mentality was quite archaic, and that's also in part why the German, say, the national monarchy failed, because that's how the king had been seen. I made a video that's quite interesting about from duchy to dukedom, especially talking about how it was called by the local noblemen, the honor of the Swabian duchy, which during the Hohenstaufen were not just Swabian dukes, but also German kings and Holy Roman emperors, could simply boast like this. You can't, say, give to the Bishop of Como this chunk of, I don't know, this little town at the fringes of the duchy, because it's our prerogative as Swabian noblemen. And the emperor was even obliged by Frederick Barbarossa to give that land back, because even as powerful as it was, like the most powerful monarch of his time in the second half of the 12th century in Europe, he couldn't mess with those guys. And naturally this happened again for reasons that, I explained in the videos about Frederick I and in his times, because again the same empire was mostly a notion of say external dominance. That's what makes an empire basically. So there was always the problem of the Roman crown, the imperial crown, and so it was easy at some point to find even some support. Easy is a big word, but I mean, you didn't need to unify all of Germany to, say, launch an invasion of Lombardy, right? And to pursue the Roman imperial dream. Also because most of these rulers really wanted to rule from Rome, or from, like the Hohenstaufen did, from Sicily, rather than Germany. That was, in that instance, gladly left behind. Like this was true also for Otto III, for those who had properly stressed the Romanity of the empire once again. And in late medieval times, you see, let's say, an entrenchment, if you want, even psychologically, from these houses that basically realize that they do not have the means to embark themselves in a universal policy. They keep, of course, maintaining their own imperial prerogatives, but they mostly tend to concentrate power in a regional or provincial dimension, and to compact politically and territorially from there. This is the trend actually that everywhere in Europe powers are following, right? The crisis is very hard, demographic contraction, economic difficulties, etc. It's obvious that there is also great coming back to the land, property, to landed property, to the sense of let's say it's an age of there aren't invasions really of Europe. That those were over. Yes, there are the Mongols, but those arrive a bit early, actually, at the peak of European civilization. In fact, they do not even achieve too much. But they, let's say, in the 14th century, in the 15th century, the idea is to exploit rather the social divide that is being formed gradually with the sinking, as you know, of the fourth estate. The peasantry really goes under and stays there until the 18th, the 19th century, especially in these areas. To, at that point, rather forging this sort of dynastic, royal, imperial aura, to eventually marrying to each other, and so as peers, like moments of crisis, a bit like, again, what happened during the 10th century with the milites that form as a sort of inter-European military class, even though Europe is all fragmented politically, but they still recognize each other owing to this. Because in this way, by marrying to each other, they could essentially inherit each other property. They could come to be elected in different kingdoms, as it happened, as you know, very often with the Luxembourgs, etc. Hungary, Germany, Poland, Bohemia, etc. So that they would get a tiny bit from each of these countries. That whose nobility would say, okay, well, so we don't have this guy here bothering us, and we entrench in our privatization system, and try to concentrate with this accumulated wealth in one of these countries. And it's a pretty, again, as we were saying before, that how eventually the political map of Europe was drawn for the end of the Middle Ages, it's not that obvious. It's not that obvious for the Luxembourg to extinguish themselves, for the Habsburgs just to rise to that level of regional power. Everything could really change, even on the basis of banal biological accidents, right? This, however, was all clothed with a very different, say, with a very strongly enhanced idea of private privilege, of sort of land connection, of, you know, household prestige, rather than the actual, let's say, capacity to recover a truly imperial scale of power. Right, the title was there; it was deeply felt. Holy Roman Emperor was a Holy Roman Emperor. This was also a way just to keep different estates, different communities, let's say, under, say, control to some extent, to get something in exchange, to offer something else, and to develop, however, on a basis that was not really what, at the peak of the empire, the German rulers had dreamt of. And that's really how it began, with the tragic demise of the Hohenstaufen. It was not really sudden, as it's sometimes described, but that would open to the phase of the so-called Great Interregnum, after the death of Frederick II of Swabia in 1250. So again, his heirs gone on for a while, but they all end, as you know, in a pretty tragic way, to say the least. And so for several decades, the elected kings of Germany were candidates that belonged, especially through the beginning, to dynasties that didn't really have a great political weight, right? And that were also rooted in actually peripheral areas of the empire, in far away, especially from the Rhineland, that was actually where the greatest wealth was concentrated in many ways, where especially the institute, let's say the Imperial Institute, the historical imperial institutions, historically recognized imperial institutions were located, right? Normally, the Imperial died for the election of King of Germany was, say, in Frankfurt, then and there was another recognition in Cologne, then there was in Aachen, the Roman crowning, etc. So everything was historical, like the empire was that. At this point, instead, you have basically peripheral rulers that are chosen by the German nobility as kings of Germany because they were expected to be weak, and so not to interfere with their affairs. What was happening in Germany is that the late Swabians had already basically forfeited the public rights of the crown in exchange for power on their own. This had given sort of free rein to the German princes to usurp some of the rest, especially after the Hohenstaufen went extinguished. And so this was the tragic route. I made a video about Richard of Cornwall and Alfonso X of Castile, but other important names are William of Holland, Adolf of Nassau, and Rodolph II of Habsburg. The latter definitely being a hell of a name, because the guy, as you know, succeeded in this clamorous enterprise of being elected. There is all an interesting background to that. If anything, I wrote a master thesis about it back in the day. That basically makes him cash all at once the southeastern Germany, defeating Ottokar II of Bohemia, that at that point was actually the most powerful prince in the empire, and therefore establishing that, again, conceptually Austrian, but of course it was a sum of these various other chunks that we have described again in that video about the Upländer. For the early modern period, but we were talking about the Middle Ages as well. And that represents one of those moves towards the east that we were talking about before. This is still within Germany. The Luxembourgs are basically adopted by the Bohemians exactly as an anti-Habsburgic reaction. So that's where, say, the greater fortunes of Prague, of the great court there, etc., Charles IV, and the redefinition of, or also of the Imperial elective rules with the Golden Bull of 1356, we will see later, really take place. There are the Wittelsbachs in Bavaria that, however, have at some point other even elective seats actually on their own, but split into different branches. This was an important condition for the Luxembourgs to give more power to, say, more votes but less power to the Wittelsbachs and the Priminate from the Habsburgs, that basically by themselves, for this reason, styled themselves under Albert IV as archdukes of Austria, to say we are important. Austria was not an electorate, but the Habsburgs thought that they deserved the title to show that they were actually as powerful, if not more. There were the Wettin, there were in Saxony, there were the Hohenzollern already. Many of these dynasties were Swabian. Historically, the Habsburgs were Swabians, the Hohenzollern were Swabians, etc. And again, the political map of Germany is quite interesting to look at in depth. Hopefully we will do it in some dedicated video as far as these dynamics are concerned. So these choices evidently witness the widening and the complication of the political play in Central Europe, right? Because this was not just about Germany, as we've seen, was about Bohemia, but it was really about how other powers would deal with this system. It was very important for the French, for example, to negotiate. It was a beautiful meeting that sort of makes you see two different times looking in each other's eyes. The young Philip IV meeting the old Rudolf of Habsburg, right? At the boundary between the empire and France, highlighting that basically France had become the real empire by that point, and Germany had, lost so much, in spite of the relentless efforts of Rudolf that really fought a lot, destroyed as many as 70 rebel castles in the Rhineland. Like, you have this, again, level of absolutely traumatic violence. It was on a regular basis. Just Germany, again, was still an incredibly primitive world. That it really had never had an eastern frontier. There had been, Magyars, Mongols, all problems of sort with the eastern frontier, the Slavs, and they had remained sort of more warlike, sort of more chivalric, more feudal in mind, and this made them also good fighters, so much so that during this crisis, as we will see, especially with the one of the minsteriales, lots of Germans began to go fight elsewhere, notably in Italy as soldiers of fortune, but literally taking over countries like Denmark literally at a monarchic level. So without mentioning that the Hanseatic League, the historical role of the Baltic Crusades, the establishment of the Teutonic Order, again, all things that I deal with in detail. These are all topics I already discussed in other videos, so if you're interested, just binge on that Medieval Germany playlist and just wait for the new updates, because if you are over, because I congratulate myself with you if you are ever over, because there are so many videos, but that's exactly the point. One must really enter into the correct mental setting, right? Mental frame. In any case, what these dynamics show is that there is a lack of an hegemonic power in the imperial area. Right? In the imperial area, broadly meant, really, you have different degrees of power, but you don't have an hegemonic power over the entire empire. Right? You may have a very strong Bohemia, as we've seen. You can have a very strong Milan, south of the Alps. You can have various, Austria, the Habsburgs were really, really powerful already. Like, we often forget that after, say, in the 90s of the 13th century, the Habsburgs reached an unprecedented power in the empire, but just was short-lived due to single issues like, the death of Albert, the son of Rudolf, or other dynastic issues. It's just like later that the Habsburgs had, especially up to the early 14th century, many shots to regain much of what had been lost by the empire. And they were unlucky, and they were opposed, especially by the same German princes in doing so. But they were kings of Poland at some point. This is very shortly known, but if you actually dig into the various agreements that were taken, it's that they did make these messes that are not conventionally, told. Right, you have to find yourself. This is true for Burgundy, for example. Like, there is this land of Burgundy that the Germans basically are not interested in anymore, but it's used to contract with the Counts of Provence. At that time are the Angevins, that are also allied with Ottokar II of Bohemia against Rudolf of Habsburg, but the papacy is sort of freaking out now more because of the Angevin interference than what the Hohenstaufen one had been. So the papacy gives the Roman crown to Rudolf of Habsburg, that does not ever come to Italy, but he gives formally to the Papal States the area of Romagna and other lands that had been contested between them. It's all this continuous mess, right? And literally, the children of Rudolf and of Habsburg and Charles of Anjou were to get married. If it hadn't been for the Sicilian Vespers, that would have completely changed the history of Europe. So it's very complicated, and you can't. That's even why you wonder why I make such long videos, because there is always a lot to really tell. But if we look at the broader later Middle Ages, there is a difficulty to properly collect and, say, valorize imperial tradition at this point. There are literal ideologies that go against it, even. The weakness, the scarce incisivity of the action, the aforementioned monarchs would have surely serious consequences for the empire. Right, this was a real blow. Right, it's structurally, systemically, it's failed. There is a collapse of some sort, and the material basis of sovereign power shrank dramatically. I recently made a video about just the previous period, the previous centuries, concerning the German royal fisc. Like, where did the German rulers take their actual funds from? How did it work? How had it been working? Because when we talk of this collapse, we also shouldn't reason much in terms of there had actually been much of a pre-existing concentrated state before, right? The German emperors had been incredibly equilibristic in terms of their capacity to agglutinate their, the German forces, just to channel them into the Imperial, to the Mediterranean dream, and really they never had even a close control on the actual entirety of the country, despite being quite active in that direction. It's not immediately apparent, but it's still very significant how the material basis of sovereign power shrank, right? In particular with the crisis of the old minsteriales. So this class of servant knights that is typically German, which had been used for this reason in order to avoid the dispersion of imperial assets, meaning they would themselves disguise as other knights, except they weren't free, and so they couldn't really do what the nobility did. But became so widespread and powerful, especially the imperial and ecclesiastical ones, that they became the next, especially in southern Germany, they became the wide majority of German knights. And by this period, basically their servile status is no more, because aside from the fact that they had at some point become so powerful to be even more so than some local noblemen, but once that the imperial authority had eclipsed itself, say what remained was just realpolitik, the fact that they were what they were, and there is a further crisis of their order anyway, because still the imperial authority had provided them with a sort of order and direction and connection. Now the greater princes were just taking over. The ministeriales alone were not organized as a whole to withstand this blow, nor they had the legal and institutional background to mount up any sort of relevant resistance. So most of them actually became just regular knights in the retinues of these other princes, but many, as we were saying before, became mercenaries. And this is just like there are some dynamics that are incredibly similar to the migration era, right? There is a collapse of a great system, and so a lot of mercenarism, a lot of destabilization, and these guys go fight. This is not much about Germany; it's about Europe as a whole, right? Germany basically starts this new invasions with this war bands, right, that are hired quickly by the best offerers, and that bring to really impressive numbers in the thousands, especially in northern Italy, and they form the backbone of the main Italian seigneurial powers, and they are really actually much better drilled and organized there than they were in Germany, where everything was still much more participative rather than on this disgregated basis, whereas actually powers like the Visconti or Florence, etc., had the capacity of properly buying these guys, hiring them, framing them in a much larger public, statal military, right? And so that's also why they were so attracted by the peninsula in this regard. And there is also, with the eclipse of imperial authority, the concession by the elected sovereigns of all the public rights. So those possessions that usually the ministeriales had control, that eventually are simply sold without anything really changing. Simply, again, there was, you want to be elected king of Germany, just sell this stuff. When you're elected, you will do it, and otherwise you wouldn't have support anyway. So it was also very simple as a system. And so the local ruler would simply buy those guys, and now it became its own, right? It was really chaotic in many ways. If you look at the map of Germany, you do realize that were particularly large and powerful princely states, right? But that they didn't correspond to largely to the older stem duchies. There was a continuity with that, especially in southern Germany, but generally speaking, the thing would fragment mostly on the basis of dynastic patrimonial dynamics. I mean, look at the history of Saxony, and why there are 3 German states called like that today. I mean, they all start from a single Saxony that then even moved its boundaries in territories that were not even Saxon. But that's because they followed the patrimonial machinations of the dynasties that were in charge there. Everything has its own coherence, but it's especially by the in the second half of the 14th century, realized that the systems sort of collapse even internally, right? That what could be held together even on that basis. That's why I say in the first half of the 14th century, I actually find still a pretty substantial power by some houses. But after that, there is a sense of tiredness, a sense of exhaustion, right? The best you find again is Prague, is Bohemia, because that had been a sort of orderly, compact kingdom that had also its own geographic boundaries. It had been historically, feudalized over time, and there were problems with the nobility there, but still, it was in the center of Europe. In this moment of destabilization, I made a bit about the rise to power of Charles IV. Should talk about John of Bohemia as well. Almost imperial, quasi fairy tale adventures across Europe, etc. But we'll talk about them in some other time. But just to give you the idea of the uncertainty from the same rulers of their own future, as a matter of fact. These were powerful, privileged people, etc. But we forget constantly that they were always this close from losing everything, and that actually great part of the stability of these lands derived from their fortunes, right? And of course they had those who would support them exactly for this reason. I hate to make these videos and remaining so vague about the actual events, but again, there is another part of Schwerpunkt that deals with the actual sort of step-by-step history of evidential history, and again, it's such a huge amount of information, starting especially to be documentable this time, that it's difficult even to frame the entire picture. The reign of Rudolf of Habsburg, as we've seen before, had actually sort of brought an end. At least the interregnum is chronologically. Some people make it stop to Rudolf's election, and I think it does make sense in a way. But indeed, even after him, there was a great Rudolf was never emperor, you see, because he thought multiple times again to arrange his Roman expedition, but the mess in Central Europe really prevented him from, making his own Italian adventures. He did, however, support, and this is the interesting thing about the whole, actually the Ghibelline party in Italy. We will see it if I prepare, I think, the next episode, a couple of, I don't know, there are some Italian communal contexts for our historical region series that can show you that, right, sending troops to these cities in central Italy just because he was the king of the Romans, and those Ghibellines there were, waiting for that support. Especially in a time in which the Guelphs had hegemonized basically the Italic kingdom largely, and so the Ghibellines were just feeling about to drown, right? And in fact, that's when other scholars put an end to the interregnum, that is, the election and crowning of the Count of Luxembourg, Henry VII. That was elected as king of the Romans, but eventually crowned in Rome as Holy Roman Emperor during his actually massive Italian expedition. He ruled essentially from 1310 to his death in Tuscany in 13. That was actually a major expedition. People say always, Dante was hoping so much in this guy, instead, he died without accomplishing anything. Not exactly. Henry's accomplishments were massive, enormous, regional in scale. Basically, he managed to shift all the factional power in the Po Valley in favor of the Ghibellines. Right, the Visconti and the Della Scala came up as imperial vikings in this moment, and in Italy there was basically another generation of war triggered by this, where also the German mercenaries that had arrived with Henry. There was essentially a French man, but he couldn't even speak German well, but he had hired all these guys that were all in part Burgundians, at least as the Italians called them, remained in service of the great Ghibelline powers, Pisa, Milan. I did talk about this in the relative videos about the city-states, and they really scored over the Guelphs great victories, primarily Montecatini, where also the great-grandson of St. Charles of Anjou was killed in combat. It was possibly the largest battle in Europe in his own time, also a magnificent one, both for the charge of the German cavalry, but also the formidable infantry wing tactics of the Italian communes. The same at Altopascio, where the Lucchese scored yet another victory over the Florentines and their Neapolitan allies. And, this all thanks actually to Henry VII, that if he had not died of illness, would have actually marched on Naples. We know from Angevin sources that King Robert did not have enough troops to stop the emperor, even though this had been defeated in front of Florence in the Tuscan countryside the season before. So actually a lot of stuff, a huge deal. But it's also truly the end, right? Later, as we'll see, we have Ludwig of Wittelsbach instead is martyr as far as German politics is concerned, because he just made a very quick expedition. He grabbed the imperial crown in Rome. He sort of looted, kidnapped different, stuff in Italy, and then attempted to besiege Milan. He failed, but came back to Germany. He was an emperor, and he actually made Bavaria great again. Well, there is not, a reference to the policy. I'm very much a universalist, so I believe in imperial boots on the ground, right? But Ludwig would have done that if he had lived in another time. That, in fact, this is exactly the moment in which the crisis is about to strike in its strongest fashion. But keeping to talk about Henry VII, you realize as a Count of Luxembourg, he didn't really have much of a power on his own. I mean, he managed to put this expedition together. It was a bit different organizationally than the ones of Swabian times that had been the last ones, effectively. But again, he was a marginal guy from the westernmost French-speaking part of the empire that ultimately managed to secure for his successors the Bohemian crown. I mean, because of his accomplishment as he had been elected King of the Romans and also crowned Holy Roman Emperor, right? So in many ways, these emperors were just trying to achieve these rulers were trying to achieve something on a very contingental basis, which had always been the case, except before they had a lot of backbone, a lot of resources available for a truly imperial universal policy. At this point, they run short of it, right? It's the French that rather have it, but also they get themselves engulfed in the mid-14th century. In the 100 Years' War, there is a massive crisis, as you know, defeats issues. So really all of Europe is engulfed in this mess. As a consequence, during this crisis, speaking of the great electors, there were new spaces forming for a first consolidation of essentially two typologies of territorial powers. The electoral principates, hence also the concept of princely Germany, and also some cities which had never actually been a power in Germany and were sort of less developed and affluent in other parts of Europe, but that still, through league system, were winning some space, some recognition, and also in virtue of the fact that imperial power protection could be bestowed on them in exchange for their loyalty, and the fact that they would have been untouchable at this point. Right. After all, imperial power was still there institutionally, and it was a big deal if, say, there was a free city of the empire, termed like this, that was sort of vexated by some other prince. I mean, just these dynasts, didn't like burghers more than much, but just by that. But they could exploit this political fragmentation, even in a time of demographic, economical contraction, for investing on those cities that had been finding their own space within this mess, where or another. I mean, many other cities actually were brought down during this period in similar ways. Even some very important ones. I mean, there is no doubt that, I don't know, if you look at how the Habsurgs settled in Vienna, well, the Viennese were not particularly, happy of, living in the center of a new powerful seigneury. But of course they were cooperating to different degrees. For example, they had supported Ottokar II as long as he remained based in Bohemia, but he had cashed Austrian, so they just supplied his army against the Hungarians during the wars that broke out when this Slavic power had entered southeastern Germany, and the Magyars thought that they wanted a piece of that as well. It's really that messed up. So the electors, the great electors, who were these? Well, essentially were, if you want, these princes, right? Given number of solidly yet informally affirming potentes, as the sources stress that, so powerful ecclesiastical and lay princes that would monopolize what had been technically a free man's, I mean, very back in time, of course, especially in Germany, sense that, again, it was the free man in arms that elected his king, right? Just like in the Romano-Germanic tradition. Naturally, in Germany, the power of sort of the lower classes had sunk from a very long time. You can talk even about the 9th to 10th century. Most people in Germany were just not free in practice. They were somebody else's people, right? And especially the people of these lords, these great lords. But even, again, the dynasties that affirmed themselves at this point were just floating over a very, sound establishment of lords that had vassals that had been ruling these communities like this from a very long time. Again, the German, when we talk about the German princes in general, we are actually talking about all these great lords. You see, in the 11th century, when a imperial election occurred at some point in the 12th and 13th, sometimes there were thousands of technically free men that were mostly, again, lords, noblemen, knights, not just the average commoner out there, that would gather to settle the matter, because those were essentially the representatives, the expression of the German Eastern Frankish people, right, as such, as a whole, this kingdom. because it's the old story we were talking about before, and a bit the reason why still there is an elective system, that the new ruler has to be accepted by the decisive majority of the people, which remains always there, because now these powerful princes are the decisive moral majority of the people. And this tells you where the other people had sunk to. So up to especially 1356, there had never been a true definition of who the actual electors of the empire had been. These were, let's say, already from the 13th century, there had been a clear idea about who the main electors in Germany really were. Right, and it's a history in its own. We'll talk about it because it's quite complicated. Because, just we were saying before, some electors would have not emerged historically as such. For example, Austria was not an elector, even though as a duchy was really powerful. Right, there were sort of minor powers to some extent that had that sort of prestige, and part of this had to do with even the formal institutional role that some of these princes had at the royal court, with some prominent functions. These guys were known as Kurfürsten, that is to say, like the cupbearers of the emperor. Right, there was this idea of still a feudal household where these are just the retinue of the senior, right? Just bring him a cup, right, to drink, and it's actually a huge privilege. That's what the electors really, of course, treasure as a concept, as an image, as an icon, if you want. And these over time had basically developed, however, on mostly that aforementioned private power base. Again, not necessarily with a degree of power, let's say, direct connection in terms of individual power. All right, there could be sort of weaker lords that, however, had a lot of connections, and so in a way or another, by the supporters, they were used as, this is the guy who has to mediate, negotiate for us, right? Even if there were actually bigger powers that were not considered formally electors, but they're still moving a lot of money around. Again, the mechanisms how this happened are complicated, can't simply digress on it now. But the most important function was, however, of course, to designate the King of Germany. Hence, at this point, the King of the Romans, which came in pair with that function, right? You know, if just the King of the Romans is the would-be Holy Roman Emperor, and in order to do the latter, you have to go to Rome. So, let's say saying King of the Romans is the guy who is being elected in Germany, and is King of the Romans, but not quite the Emperor of the Romans. And so, it's just a way to say, well, we sort of are the reference point for the Imperial Roman authority, after all, even if we still haven't taken that fundamental step of going to Italy, etc. So famously enough, these are three lay and four, three ecclesiastical and four lay electors. All right, the three archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Köln. These are also, they have a universal function. Technically, Mainz has a sort of pastoral care symbolically for Germany, Trier for France, and Cologne for Italy. Then you have the Duke of Saxony, the Marquis of Brandenburg, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and the King of Bohemia. Right, so you see, it's even, where is Swabia, where is Bavaria, where is, there, and again, they would in fact end up like the Wittelsbachs to get some of these even at the time of the, or exactly because of the will of Charles IV, so to extromit, for example, the Habsburgs from cumulating that, because simply some of these titles had become token for, especially the lay ones, as you understand, you couldn't quite become a, yes, you could have someone becoming the archbishop of one of the three ecclesiastical electors, but cities, but the most of the game would be played for lay ones. So it's a college of 7, and there is a lot of mythology around it. Some even said that, given still the importance that these polities had back in the day, there was a mythical Carolingian or Ottonian route to the 7, to the magic 7, right? But it's really not the case. They had already come to be that relevant and recognized and almost formally and officially recognized until, in fact, the fixing of the Golden Bull of 1356, promulgated by the Emperor Charles IV of Luxembourg of Bohemia, that again had basically the objective of extremiting the Habsburgs from this, and so even the choice is technically connected with that in part. The Golden Bull, however, was an important step into that process of regionalization that we will see better, I think, tomorrow, given that I think this is going to be longer than 2 parts, definitely, yes. Through the procedures and rites even of, ritualities proper of election, but also incisive norms on the indivisibility, for example, of the electoral principates, interestingly enough. So the effort, at least on a provincial scale, to just keep those states together, because this was sort of, what, after all these great houses were trying to do for each one, together with the rights of royal pertinence that were at this point attributed to them. This is fascinating as an idea, because basically these electors were recognized a degree of royal power within their own territories. We're talking about the foundations, really, of public authority: mints, mines, salt mines, and salt, tolls, etc., jurisdiction of last instance. So all, a higher authority that, as you understand here, is basically turning these princes into real state rulers in some degree. So a fragmentation of what had been the previous prerogatives of the German monarch. Speaking of cities, finally, and especially during the period of the Great Interregnum, you can see the foundation of the development from the side of these centers that were, again, all of limited demographic consistency, right? But very limited consistency compared to the standards of other European areas, such as central northern Italy or Flanders, right? For a circumscribed role that, however, does not to be overlooked, because it sort of sanctioned the possibility of organizing their own territory, right? This is also a complex topic, because essentially the city in Germany doesn't quite have much of an hinterland at all, right? Actually, as soon as you come out of the walls, there is a prince that says, "Here I command." It's a bishop, a count, typically. However, there is, in the face, we will see it better next time, of local turmoil, wars, devastations, robber barons, these leagues issue, and that's how also the Helvetic Confederacy was born, basically. A Landfried, right? So literally a pacification of the land, which was yet another public prerogative that, however, in this sort of sometimes peripheral areas, these cities, and together with local counts and so aristocrats, right, decide to solve the problem, to form an alliance, basically, to keep the enemies out. And some of them are even successful. They all finish badly, right? If you look at the history of the Rhineland, the Rhine League, the Swabian League, etc., they rise and fall, basically. But it's still relevant because it shows a dynamism which before the collapse of the monarchy had not really been possible to be had, right? In fact, you have not really a great number, but still, because of this important concessions to the so-called free cities, right, that are in general, like, mostly located in the Rhineland area. That was, again, the richest. And that had historically been subjected especially to bishops. For example, the same Mainz, Cologne, Basel, Strasbourg, Speyer. These were also a bit the symbols of the empire, but I made a video about Cologne specifically at some point. The inhabitants of the city managed to overthrow the bishop that actually maintains a territorial lordship all around the city, and also a very powerful one, but the city manages to keep the guy out. So it basically, say, out in a seigneurial sense, because of course it was still the bishop of Cologne. But that's what I was saying before, that even in the cases of greatest urban power in Germany, you have a limited power essentially within the city walls. Outside of that, it's the lords that rule. But Speyer, Cologne, as we've said, these are centers really had been important in imperial times. And the reason why these cities were given free rights and as such directly, they had to respond directly only to the emperor without any intermediary, any other lord, signifies both the, let's say, the collapse of what had been traditionally the connection between royal and ecclesiastical authority, say better, episcopal authority. Of course, the church here, everybody's, say, they have, some emperors may have problems with the papacy, but say the German episcopate, enemy or not, is still, there is not a reformistic anti-ecclesiastical sense here going on at all. But some of these bishops had historically, like in most countries, actually backed royal power because they were defended by it. And then when royal power starts collapsing, given that some of them are already very powerful, they say, well, you know what, it's better now just to be on our own. And if they were on their own, the kings of Germany still exist, can say, well, okay, then I will grant the burghers of the city some city rights that basically will make that center directly connected to me. And I will earn something out of that, and the cities will bring their own, let's say, their own ingenuity, their own representations, their own crafts, whatever. Also the Imperial Knights, we will see better later. They're all represented because they're in this fragmented reality. The more the system is fragmented, the more diversified has to be the pool of horses you want to bet on, right? So these cities are really meaningful, symbolic, and as long as you are the emperor, you can confer them with these rights and connect them with you, especially in some of the richest areas of the empire. Not that you would even imagine to reach there territorially in a contiguous sense if you especially rule from Bohemia or Austria or Bavaria, but right, it's still something. These were the Reichsstädte, so obviously the cities of the empire, the Freie Reichsstädte, the free cities of the empire. That also would join the aforementioned leagues, but they were a bit the core of that. Paradoxically, later on, in different regions and different times, let's say, joining leagues against the same imperial power. Right, and one interesting aspect of these cities is that they are starting to write down now their own customary law as well, right? Because it's not just, I mean, they would already have some of that, but the imperial recognition makes them also more ambitious on their own, right? Cities do not have really a great, again, fortune in Germany in terms of political autonomy, but some, these are the exceptions, the relevant exceptions do, right? And at some point you would see even some noble bloodshed on the battlefields by the hands of these commoners, right? Nothing extreme, right? Germany doesn't really have much of that phenomenon of infantry development towards the, say, the 13th or 14th century. They had something, but nothing comparing even with Flanders and so this is just how they exploited them contingentally. Much greater was, instead, on a regular basis, the amount of urban centers were subjected to a lord, and thus framed in those that will be the territorial states. The ones that were forming, that were taking shape, as you've seen even from the maps that I uploaded here. And if you really look at these maps, you will realize that the states that are forming at this point have barely anything to do with the, I mean, they do, as I was saying, to some extent, but let's say aside from Bavaria and Austria and Bohemia remaining a kingdom on its own, separated from the German one, you don't really have much anything recognizable politically, territorially on the map as what had been the historical stamp duchies. You have an interesting growth of some marks in the east, you have, but mostly a fragmentation, really. Right? If you look at the various electorates, the Palatine one, the one of Mainz, the one of Trier, they're all fragmented, they're all scattered, right? And so it's all extremely messy, and actually some of the most compact domains, are territorial at least, are sort of peripheral, like the Duchy of Brabant, the County of France, Franche-Comté, the Duchy of Luxembourg, etc. And so it's all very complicated puzzle there that requires, if you want to study it, as we were saying before, a great attention for the local realities, but also for the whole. Because at the end of the day, this, yes, was a single country. You see, when I say that this system was so fragmented, doesn't mean that, say, if you look at the Kingdom of France, it was all a wall on the maps that we draw, that actually Kingdom of France did not have a level of internal fragmentation. I mean, every country had basically this level of decentralized government, for which you know, even in a unitary context, you would have this guys answering, just, you know, taking some matters in their own hands. The problem is that Germany doesn't have a single authority doing so. I mean, in theory it has. It's the emperor, it's the king of Germany. But in practice, some of these places are properly irresponsive. I mean, we will see it better. There are some areas that do not actually even interact with imperial authority, and that are, and I'm talking within Germany. Today's video is about Germany specifically, but the point being is that to some extent the emperors, but this other rulers also during the power interregnum, to an extent, wouldn't even care about it. It may seem strange, but the concept that, I don't know, I need first and foremost, like this elector, say, giving me his vote, so that I can consolidate whatever's going on in my own principality is way more important than whatever, I don't know, the Frisians do. And it's not to say that the Frisians wouldn't count, even in this incredibly complicated mechanism or whatever. But at the end of the day, it was an economy that was just about choices, right? So think about this Western dynasties at some point literally moving most of their assets, their household, their court to the east, right, from Alsace from Swabia to Austria, let's say, like the Habsurgs do. It's it was feasible, like there was nothing really strange in principle, but just think about what it means in terms of the level of options and the clarity of pursuit that existed at this point. Actually, if you look at the reasons why they do it at the given moment, given the political situation, etc., you will realize that it's obvious, right? You get a bit like the ABC of what was going on at the time. You would have probably guessed it. You would have guessed it yourself as a viable option, as an advantageous one. So it's all truly a history that I think more than at a local level must be understood as a bigger one, because there are indeed this kind of dynamics. Like I'm looking at, for example, one of the pictures here, because if you hear me taping on the keyboard, it's because I'm adjusting, same time trying to adjust the color balance for all the pictures. Here just I have in front of me the one about Straubing, Holland. So something literally from Bavaria, from the Danube to Holland, to Friesland. You have the Hennegau, Mont, even places like Rotterdam, then Den Haag, Amsterdam, and connected with Straubing, with Regensburg, and the Wittelsbachs did enjoy this sort of one interesting thing that, like, the Luxembourgs managed to keep to give the Wittelsbachs multiple electorates, but not even more than theirs, but still ruling. It was that in the Golden Bull they had also issued that it was the same, in order to play the same vote, they would have to or to have the same weight in the election. I don't remember now, but it made a bit about the rise of Charles IV explaining that. They would have had to be part of the same house. And given that the Wittelsbachs had branched out, like the Habsburgs, into 4 distinct dynasties, of course, it was easy for the Luxembourgs that instead were the head of a single kingdom like Bohemia just to maneuver the system. And so the Wittelsbachs, as Wittelsbachs, but different branches actually of the same, would have lots of different possessions, even electorates, scattered all over Germany. It was just a dynastic thing, and it was just one of, of comfort, right? Obviously, from this was completely normal, like having, as we've seen, an external ruler installed in your own local territory. The ruler traditionally had just to rule this place, essentially protecting the customs of this specific territory. And if the guys locally didn't like him, there wasn't really much that could be done for him to centralize to, but to impose his power. Naturally, this was happening in parallel in moments in which, of course, there were enemies all around, so you had to play functionally anyway. In the same communities called you also as a protector, there is no doubt. But there are lots of different and interesting implications regarding these mechanisms of power that I think you have to spend a lifetime studying German history in order to understand properly. We do our share on Schwerpunkt. Here I have the last 4 pictures to adjust the color balance of reason for which, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.